Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with my January wrap-up. My very first book I finished in 2018 was Under the Never Sky by Veronica Rossi. This is the first book in a dystopian / science fiction trilogy, and it follows a main character who realizes something is wrong with the world she lives in, and is forced to join forces with an outsider, somebody who is very much a wilder culture than hers. It's a pretty basic premise, but I actually really enjoyed this book. I do think the first part of the book was a little slow, but once we started getting into more of the character things and the interactions between them and a couple of big plot points that happened, things really started taking off. And also, since this book does heavily feature a romance between the two main characters, Arya and Perry, I'm happy to say that I actually did enjoy them as a couple. So I think that was another reason that I really enjoyed this book, was I liked seeing the characters interact with each other. I enjoyed figuring out where the plot was going to go. I really liked the world building elements that we eventually get about the outside world. Not so much where Arya lives, but Perry and his sort of culture and the groups of his people and how their society works. I really enjoyed that. So I am looking forward to picking the next book in this trilogy up, and I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I finished A Tangled Web by L.M. Montgomery. Basically, this cranky old lady decides she's going to leave this heirloom jug to one person in her family, and that's kind of the setup. That's why all of the family is gathered and waiting to hear, and because everybody wants this jug. And it's basically just a satire on family and friends and the petty little fights that people can have and connections between people. It's a very character-driven story. And I had a lot of mixed feelings about this one. There were a couple of storylines and a couple of characters that I really liked and I enjoyed them, but the majority of plot lines that were interwoven in this book I just either flat out didn't care or I actively disliked them. At one point, somebody strangles a kitten, and there really was no reason for that to happen in the story. This is actually the second or third time that I've read one of these authors' books and a pet, like a beloved animal, died tragically, so I don't know what L.M. Montgomery's deal was with animals, but it was really upsetting. It was really weird. And then on the very last page of this book, we have a racial slur that is used for no apparent reason. And we weren't really supposed to believe that the character who uses it was being set up that way. It just felt really unnecessary, and I've seen other people complain about it, and I just don't know why it was there. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I finished Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. And in this world, we follow a very ordinary main character named Richard, and he lives in London. He's got a pretty good job, a very high-powered fiance. His life is pretty average. And then one day he helps a girl in danger and his life just gets thrown off the rails. He is pulled into this strange world of London below, which is full of unusual people and creatures and frightening places, and basically it turns into this epic quest trying to figure out who murdered the family of this girl Dor, who he helped. I really liked this book. I thought the writing style was really clever and funny and really moving at times. I thought the plot was also really interesting. There were a couple of big reveals that I think could have been done better, but overall I really liked the storylines. I did really love how Richard was just this ordinary person who did the right thing and got thrown into this crazy world. And also there were parts of this book that were genuinely frightening. There's a scene that happens. Richard has to go through this kind of trial, and it really scared me. The villains in this book are horrifying. The kind of tag team of bad guys were, they just made my skin crawl every time they were on the page, and I gave Neverwhere 4 stars. Next, I finished The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. You guys have probably been hearing a lot about this book, so I will do a very brief summary, I promise. Jude, our main character, is a human, and when she's 7 years old, her parents are slaughtered in front of her. She and her 2 sisters are taken away to live in fairy for the rest of their lives. Now, Jude wants to be like these fairies. She admires their strength and their beauty and their otherworldly power, so she has made it her mission in life to become accepted by them. Of course, that's very difficult to do. And we follow her as she gets caught up in this web of intrigue and politics and just all this danger that exists in the fairy world, and Jude has to ultimately decide how far she's willing to go to get the things she wants. So I did a full review on this book that has spoiler-free and spoiler sections, so I will link that down below. so you can get my full thoughts on it. But I did really enjoy this one, and I highly recommend it if you like dark fairy stories, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Next, I picked up Wicked Lovely by Melissa Marr. This is the first book in a series, and it's another kind of dark fae story. And in this book, we follow our main character, Ashlyn, who has grown up always being able to see fairies, and they're frightening and horrible, and basically you're out of luck. You don't actually want to see these fairies. And her grandmother and her mother also had this gift, so Ashlyn has gone her whole life knowing not to draw attention to herself. She can never let fairies know that she can see them. Unfortunately, I was pretty disappointed in this book. I think reading it right after The Cruel Prince was also like a problem with it, and that's on me. But I didn't feel anything for the main character. Ashlyn was just like a limp noodle. She did nothing. Her quasi-boyfriend was like kind of ridiculous to me. He was like that typical, oh, he looks like a bad boy on the outside, but he's really just like looking for someone to love him. He also seems like he's a lot older than Ashlyn. I don't remember his age in the book, but he acts like he's like 25, and Ashlyn reads like a 16-year-old at the highest. And their relationship was just really weird. I think what was his name? Seth? It was Seth. I completely forgot his name. Wasn't interesting to me at all. I didn't really like the plot. It felt like nothing really happened for a while, and then when it did, the same thing kept happening over and over. I did think the writing style was good, and I really liked the fairies themselves, like the glimpses we got of their world and of certain characters. I believe her name was Donia, who was sort of set up as the rival to Ashlyn. I really liked Donia, and I liked where her storyline went, so I think if we follow her in the sequels, or like we see more of her, I would really enjoy it. I am going to continue with the series because I saw enough that I liked that I'm interested to find out more. I gave Wicked Lovely 2 stars. The next book I finished was my first official rereadathon pick for 2018, and my challenge I chose for January was to reread my favorite standalone, and that was The Princess Curse by Mary Haskell. This was the #1 book of last year for me, and I loved it just as much, if not more, the second time. It's set in sort of a version of Romania. It's a slightly different country, but it's in that area of Europe. And it's a fantasy world, and I really don't want to say too much about the plot because I think it's important to kind of discover it in little pieces as you go through. But I loved our main character, Rebecca. I think that's how you say it, Rebecca. And she was just so smart and just determined and brave and funny, and she was just like such a great protagonist to follow. And I just loved the writing and the story and the world of this book. I'm kind of rambling a little bit because I honestly don't know what else to say except that I adored this book and I highly recommend it. And I'm just gonna stop talking because what else is there to say? This is fantastic. 5 out of 5 stars. The next book I finished was The Sin Eater's Daughter by Melinda Salisbury. This is the first book in a trilogy. This girl, she can kill with her touch, and she is kept as the executioner for the kingdom because she is what is known as Dawnin embodied, so she is the physical embodiment of one of their gods, and as such her duty is to discharge justice against those committing treason. And it sounds more complicated than it is. Basically, she kills people because they tell her to. And I really didn't like this book. I'll talk about the good things first because there was like only one, and that was the fact that I really loved the glimpses we got of the actual practice of sin eating, which was this like tradition where when somebody died, somebody who was known as a sin eater would come to their coffin, and like the family had laid out a feast basically on the coffin with each food representing a particular sin, and the sin eater would consume that food and so consume the sins of that person so that they could go on to the afterlife. And I really found that fascinating. I liked all of those little bits that we got, and there were also some glimpses of the other kind of world building or like folklore elements that I really enjoyed in this book. Unfortunately, everything else I did not like at all. Twila, our main character, oh my god, she was so, like, I can't even say she was irritating for most of the book because that would imply that she did something, and she didn't. And like there's multiple times where she either tells somebody or thinks to herself about how sad she is that she has never had any freedom. She's never had choices. She never got to make any decisions for herself. And I'm just like, every time that would happen, I'm like, girl, what are you talking about? Like, you've never done anything. You've never made a decision. Like, what do you mean you don't have any freedom? You wouldn't do anything with it if you had it. And I know that sounds very harsh, but this book took me so long to read, and it was not very long, and it's because I disliked it so much. And her half-baked romance with the guard was just the most ridiculous thing. It actually reminded me of how when I was first learning about acting and I was taking acting classes, we were talking about chemistry in between performers. And I remember thinking when I started out, like, oh, that's not really true. If you're a good actor, you can convince people that you're in love with this person. And then I saw Bonnie Wright and Daniel Radcliffe having to interact in the later Harry Potter movies, and I realized I was wrong. There is such a thing as bad chemistry, and it's awful. And that's what happened in this book. Every time she would talk to him, I would fall asleep. Like, he was just so irritating, and they had no spark, and it was just like, basically they fell in love because they were near each other. Like, what? What? The author tries to throw out all these crazy plot twists, like, near the very end, and the ones that did surprise me were still not enough to save the book, because by this point, it's like 300 pages in, and something finally happens, and I'm like, it's too late, man. I already don't care. And I'm gonna stop now. I'm sorry. I did not intend to rant about this book so much, but apparently I was repressing a lot of feelings about it. So I gave The Sin Eater's Daughter 1.5 stars. The 0.5 stars was because of the world building. The next book I finished was The Black Witch by Laurie Forest. And this is another one that I have already done a full review and discussion on, and the whole video is spoiler free, so I will link that down below again so I don't have to go into too much detail here. I felt like it was a thoughtful and well-developed examination of some of the problems we have in our world. It's a fantasy novel. We follow a main character who looks exactly like her powerful grandmother but does not possess any of her magical abilities. And in this fantasy world there are lots of warring clans and species and races. Basically every group has been brought up to believe that everyone from any other group are horrible and just animals. They're not people. So this book examines the prejudices of that and really critiques them in, I think, thoughtful ways, and I ended up giving this book 4 stars. The next book I finished was Blackheart by Holly Black, and this is the third and final book in the Curse Workers trilogy. And in this world, it's like kind of an urban fantasy setting, and it's exactly like our world, except that some people are born with the ability to curse people. It's basically like very specific kinds of magic, and you can be a luck worker, an emotion worker, a death worker. I think there's 6 types of worker you can be. And obviously not everybody is born like that, but the ones who are have formed themselves into crime families because it is against the law to work anybody. So naturally, if you do, then you basically become the magical fantasy version of the mafia. But we follow our main character, Castle Sharp, as he continues to like exploit people and manipulate them and go back and forth between being a good guy and a bad guy. And I ultimately found this finale pretty disappointing. The things that I enjoyed about the other books, I still enjoyed. I love Castle as a protagonist. He's probably one of my most recent favorite characters. And I did admire the cleverness of his cons, and like that was one thing I really enjoyed from the other books. But I feel like in this book, those weren't as interesting. Like the plot and the escapades basically he had to go on, I didn't think were done as well. And another big reason I didn't like this book as much was a personal preference based on the fact that there were a couple of supporting characters who I thought got way too much page time in this book. Like half the book was taken up with this 1 or 2 characters who I don't like, and that really dragged it down for me. But I think I could have maybe overlooked some of those things if the ending hadn't been the most dissatisfying, anticlimactic thing I've read in a very long time. And again, I can't say that much about it because this is the end of a trilogy, but I was left wanting more. I am gonna say I think that if Castle were a female character, that ending would not have flown. And I'm really disappointed. I gave this 3.75 stars, and I would have rounded up to 4, except that I woke up the next morning and I hadn't rated this book yet, and I was still so pissed off at the ending that I'm like, I can't make myself give it 4 stars. So I've officially rated something with a 1/4 point now. It is 3.75 stars. But I still highly recommend the trilogy overall, especially because I definitely don't think the things that bothered me are gonna bother everyone. And finally, the last book I finished in January was The Exiled Queen by Cinda Williams Chima. This is the second book in the 7 Realms series, and we continue pretty immediately from the first book. We follow the same cast of characters, and this book is actually set more as like a magical school type of book. And I ended up really enjoying that aspect of this. I didn't rate this quite as highly as the first book because I do feel there were some flaws with this one. First off, like, nothing happens that really matters to the plot for 200 pages. And I really enjoy lots of slow-paced books. But when you have a slow-paced book, you're still going somewhere. And I felt like for 200 pages, this book didn't go anywhere. And then again, there were a couple of the like supporting characters who I thought weren't necessarily fleshed out that well. Like Eamon, one of the guards, his whole personality is that he's a guard. And I just got really tired of him because he had just no depth at all. There were a lot of things I enjoyed about this book. Raisa, the main character, or one of the main characters, has become one of the highlights of this series for me. And I didn't much care for her in the first book. She felt very immature, very cookie-cutter, princess type character. And now she's just taking charge and standing up for her kingdom, and it's just wonderful to see. So I love that character development. I'm also really getting invested in her relationship with the other protagonist, which in the first book I wasn't on board for it, but after this one I'm definitely interested to see where that goes. And we also have a really great antagonist in this book. Micah Bayar is just... I was talking to Rebecca from Tea Hags about this series, and we were talking about Micah, and we both agree that he's like the fandom version of Draco Malfoy. Basically like if Malfoy had gotten a redemption arc that a lot of us wanted him to have, or if he got more page time and the opportunity to make different choices. I'm not saying Micah is like an anti-hero or he's misunderstood, but I'm so glad he's in this series, because even though him showing up is usually bad news, things happen when he's around, and he reminds me of like Draco Malfoy and a little bit of Artemis Fowl, so of course he's one of my favorite characters in this book. And I gave The Exiled Queen 3.5 stars. Also, I'm just gonna say something, and this is not a spoiler because unless you have read this book, you will have no idea what I'm talking about, but Fire Dancer can do better. I'm just gonna say that. Okay, you guys, so those are all of the books I read in January. I think I had at least one from every rating. Like 1 through 5, I'm pretty sure I had something in every category. You guys should definitely let me know in the comments what your favorite and least favorite book you read in January was. I hope your reading year is off to a good start. Thank you guys for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!